Felipe Hernández. I'm from San Lucas Chiavini, Tlacolula, Oaxaca, and I speak Zapotec from the village. And well, basically, what I want to talk about my language is that it's the languages right now. It's sort of I wouldn't say disappearing, but I think it's going over some changes. Several factors I think that we need to consider and talk about why the language is the population is diminishing right now. It used to be about 5 years ago, or I think in the census of 2000, we used to be like the 97% of the population spoke Zapotec only. However, what the census doesn't tell you is that the Zapotec that right now the children speak, it's very much mixed with Spanish. And they are, we did in 2004, I think that we did a study with Pam Monroe. We went to the village and then we presented, we had in 1999, we had published a trilingual dictionary, which we went to present the village. And what we did is that we presented the village, we went to the school, we talked to the children, and then we asked them if they recognize some of the words that were in the dictionary. And also we asked them one particular word that I remember was the word for turtle, and they said, like, how do you say turtle in Zapotec? And everybody's like, don't you know, you wrote a dictionary, right? And I said, we asked them, okay, so what is it? And they said tortuga, which is derived from Spanish, tortuga, right? But there is a word which is called bejo. So when we explained to them what that what they were saying was in Spanish, and then we explained to them the evolution of languages and the impact of Spanish and languages, and they said, "Oh yeah, I remember my uncle, my grandfather speaking." So in just talking to them, we realized that that Zapotec was in the process of changing and incorporating a lot of the youngsters. They were incorporating a lot of Spanish into Zapotec. So we sat with them, and then what we had done with the dictionary was that we had talked to a lot of older folks and asking them. I mean, even in my generation, we've been using a lot of Spanish words into Zapotec. So in a sense, there is the impact of Spanish to school, that in Mexico there is a policy from 1920s on through the Instituto Nacional Indigenista. There has been a policy in which they were trying to incorporate the indigenous population to the mainstream, right? And saying that speaking an indigenous language was not okay, because they wanted to Mexicanize indigenous people. There was a policy in which they wanted to Mexicanize India, not Indianize Mexico. So in that sense, I mean, the policies were very, very much focused through assimilation. And there was a process and also training of teachers where they formed in 1929, they formed this brigade of rural teachers, where the idea was to teach an indigenous person to speak Spanish. And there was a phrase which says, "Haz patria, mexicaniza los indígenas," right? So I mean, it's pretty clear that there was no space for indigenous languages or indigenous people in Mexico. And that has been from the early 1920s with the first Minister of Education. There was this process of assimilation. So I think that has a tremendous impact, since the rural teachers, they went and assimilate people, right? So if, in a sense, if you spoke indigenous language, you were castigated, you were punished by rural teachers. So in 1970s, there was a backlash of the policies they had implemented. In 1970s, there was a movement of rural teachers where they all of a sudden realized, wait a minute, I'm helping to disappear my language, basically is what they were saying. So they reverted that. And unfortunately, in a lot of villages, for example, I have visited so many villages and very nearby the city, which is San Juan, Teitipac, for example. They rarely speak an indigenous language, Zapotec. But in my village, some reason the policy was not, it didn't have a great impact, so people keep speaking the language, and we were sort of very marginalized by the process of assimilation. And around 1968, people started migrating to United States. In 1968, the first person went to the States, and then there was this snowball process of migration. And with the migration process, I think that we began to see the impact of migration, the impact on the language itself. And then when they returned, they had different ideas of what they should be doing and so forth. So they began speaking more Spanish than Zapotec. And as more and more people began to migrate, they started teaching their kids Spanish or English for that matter. And actually, I went to the U.S. in 1979, I think, a long time ago. Yes, in 1979. Anyways, when I got to the States, and then I started to get involved in my community, and in around 1990, I went to UCLA, and I realized that just by speaking to people in the States and by going back to my village, I realized that the language was slowly disappearing or becoming more with more Spanish words into it, and then I realized that I need to do something.